My sound's a little low. I do want to get started, though. Welcome, everybody, to tonight's rendition of Lost Leviathans. Tonight we're going to be talking about the biggest ship still missing on Lake Huron. Lake Huron's a little different than some of the other Great Lakes, so I think it's going to be a pretty interesting talk. I found some very interesting stuff when I was doing the research for this particular talk. So just for starters, I know most of you know who I am, but I'm Brendon Baillod. I'm the administrator of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group on Facebook. Our group was started, I guess maybe about 10 years ago for people who are pretty serious Great Lakes shipwreck researchers, people who were interested in telling the stories of lost ships and interested in finding them. Since then, the group has grown to include thousands of people, many of whom are just casually interested. A little bit about my background. I've written a couple of books on Great Lakes shipwrecks. I occasionally consult on documentaries on television, the National Geographic, Travel Channel, things like that. A lot of the things that I'm interested, though, outside of general Great Lakes shipwrecks, are the shipwrecks of the Keweenaw Peninsula, where I grew up and where I'm from. There are about 140 shipwrecks up there, and I'm constantly looking for new ones up in that area. Also looking at the shipwrecks of the Beaver and Fox Islands on Lake Michigan. Beautiful area. I've been out there quite a few times researching. All the pins you see here are different shipwrecks in the Beavers and Foxes that I've researched. Many of you might know me from my book, Fathoms Deep But Not Forgotten, about the shipwrecks in southeastern Wisconsin. I also do a fair amount of wreck hunting on the Great Lakes. But probably what I'm best known for is my collection of Great Lakes maritime antiquities, so antique photos, postcards, things of that nature, antique books related to Great Lakes shipwrecks, and of course the education that I do on social media. I'm also the president of the Wisconsin Underwater Archaeology Association. We're a group that provides opportunities for the public to participate in underwater archaeology, and so, for example, we own a side-scan sonar, we own a few ROVs, and we take people out in the field and let them use them. And we teach them how to use them as well. So, pretty active organization. If you're not a member, feel free to join. $20 a year, WUAA.org. All right, so much for the commercial portion of my presentation. Let's talk about Lake Huron's shipwrecks. So first of all, I want to give you a little bit of background on where these numbers come from that I'm going to talk about tonight about Great Lakes shipwrecks. So we know, for example, that about 40,000 commercial vessels sailed on the Great Lakes, in the modern era, 1678 to 1960. How do we know this? Well, we know this because vessels had to be enrolled at customs houses on the Great Lakes, both in the U.S. and Canada, starting in about 1800, and most of those records have been preserved. So we actually do have pretty good records of all the ships that ever sailed the lakes. And we know what happened to them. They had to surrender their enrollment documents when they were lost. There are good insurance records, there are wreck reports, there's all sorts of information. And so that's been compiled, right, into a couple of really good databases that are online. For example, we know that Lake Michigan kind of leads the pack by a little bit with 26.5% of the wrecks. Lake Huron right below that, and followed by Lake Erie, and then Lake Ontario with only 12%, and Lake Superior with 11%. There's some reasons for these, and I'll talk about them as we go. But when you hear this figure about how many shipwrecks are on the lakes, you often hear a figure about 6,000, 8,000, 10,000. A lot of people are just guessing at that. We actually have a pretty good idea of how many shipwrecks there are on the Great Lakes, and I'm going to explain why. Part of the way we know is because of this, the Swayze Shipwreck Database. So, beginning about 30 years ago, Dave Swayze combed through every book that had been written about Great Lakes maritime history and started to build a database of all the well-known shipwrecks. And it started to gain momentum, and others of us started to chip in. People like myself, Walter Lewis, Bill McNeil, Pat Labadie. We started to submit wrecks that were not as well known. And pretty soon, we got to about 5,000 shipwrecks, and we kept finding more and more. So, say here, if I go to Lake Huron, it wants more search criteria, and I tell it that I want to look at all the schooners on Lake Huron, I can bring up a list of all the schooners that wrecked on Lake Huron. And if I want to look at the ones that get more information, I click on it. It's going to tell me where it was lost and some detail about it and the sources we used to make that record, right? One of the things that I've done is I've gone through this entire database and behind the scenes, not in the searchable version here, and I've flagged every wreck that's been found, that's diveable or that's been found under a beach or on a reef. And I've also flagged all the ships that went down out in deep water. So I really do know from looking at that how many ships are still missing out on the Great Lakes versus how many sank in harbors and rivers, how many are fragmentary. If you want to count all the vessels that have remains on the Great Lakes, like old hulks that are sunk in harbors and rivers that weren't really lost due to a wreck, yeah, you might hit 8,000. But really, if you want to talk about shipwrecks that actually were lost due to an accident, there are about 6,000 on the Great Lakes. Now, the vast majority of those are under beaches and on reefs, broken up. In other words, they're not big intact ships like you think about. They're archaeological sites. They're fragmentary. But a lot of these do have extant remains. Probably about 4,000 of these ships still have some remains. Like you could find some pieces of them if you found the location where they wrecked. And a lot of them, like I say, you're going to find some scraps of wood. If it wrecked on hard rock, you might just find metal fittings, But they have extant remains from the shipwreck. Interestingly enough, about 3,000 of the known shipwrecks on the Great Lakes have been found or identified. Of those, maybe 1,000 of them are diveable shipwrecks that people like to visit. The rest of them are fragmentary. They're things that are on reefs or that are under beaches, but archaeologists know about. Like here in Wisconsin, we've documented hundreds of ships that are, kind of buried or just off the beach, but they're not really dive targets. So let's talk a little bit about the numbers of missing ships. When I went through the database, the Swayze database, and I took out all the vessels that broke up on shore or that are under a beach or that were scuttled or that have been found and verified, the numbers got a lot smaller. And so when I went through the Lake Michigan portion, I found about 220 wrecks that were lost offshore, ships that were lost offshore and that hadn't been found yet. That's a lot. And there are some reasons why Lake Michigan has so many compared to Lake Huron. I'm going to talk about that tonight. I went through Lake Superior, and I only found about 70 ships that were still missing, that hadn't been found. That's because Lake Superior just didn't have that many vessels on it because it didn't have any major cities. For the record, I have not yet finished going through Lake Erie or Lake Ontario, but I suspect we're going to find about 150 on Lake Erie and about 70 on Lake Ontario. But I just finished Lake Huron, and I found 111 ships that are still missing on Lake Huron. And part of the way I did it is by talking a lot with David Trotter, who will become an important part of the talk tonight. A lot of the Lake Huron shipwrecks have been found. That's why it's got 110 versus 220 on Lake Michigan. Then there's a lot of shipwreck maps and charts out there that show shipwrecks on Lake Huron, like Pete Caesar's chart here, which is kind of fanciful, right? Or Paul Ackerman's Great Lakes dive guides, show sort of the dive targets and fanciful charts, but they don't really give you a good graphical distribution of where the wrecks are. If you want to know where the wrecks are, you kind of have to look at something like this. This is Calvin Deviney's treasure chart series. He made them in 1961. But he did a really good job for the day, and he really researched well. His charts were way ahead of their time. And this shows a pretty good, he's missing maybe a third of the wrecks that we found after we started to do in-depth original research. But you get to see the spatial distribution of wrecks. There's some choke points on the lake. Specifically, the Thumb, crossing Saginaw Bay, especially the Thunder Bay area here in Presqu'île. Down here by Port Huron, because that's a choke point where a lot of ships came, And you don't see it here because he puts a lot of them in Lake Michigan on his chart, but the straits, obviously, are also a pretty heavy choke point, as is Detour up here, because there was a lot of vessel traffic. So, there are a lot of shipwrecks. Now, why is Lake Huron different? Well, it was primarily a transit lake. There were very few large ports on Lake Huron. We don't have the Chicagos, the Milwaukees, the Clevelands, the Buffalos. It's also noteworthy that for analysis purposes, Lake Huron is really two different lakes. Georgian Bay saw very different traffic than the rest of the lake. Georgian Bay saw really a lot of like pulpwood and small passenger steamers going between the little towns, whereas the rest of the lake down here was a transit lake, where the big heavy ore boats and bulk carriers that were coming out of Lake Superior and Lake Michigan heading for the eastern lakes, came through. There were also fewer small local trading vessels, so you didn't see the large number of 60-foot schooners that were running between little ports like you had on Lake Michigan and Lake Erie. Now, the biggest difference, though, that you're going to hear about tonight is that a high percentage of Lake Huron's missing ships have been found due to intensive wreck hunting. Lake Huron has probably seen the most wreck hunting of any of the 5 Great Lakes, certainly the most successful wreck hunting. There's also a high number of shipwreck preserves and sanctuaries. So there was an early emphasis in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s on identifying these historic ships and setting up these underwater preserves. Both the Michigan Underwater Preserve System, which has a number of preserves, the Thumb, Sanilac Shores, Thunder Bay was one, the Straits, and then also the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, which was established, I think, going on 25 years ago now. And so a lot of the ships have been found. Most of the ships that remain to be found are either far from shore, they're on Georgian Bay, which is fairly remote and has a low population, or they're small. And so that's the main difference. Lake Huron certainly has a lot of wrecks, but honestly, a lot of them have been found. Now, if we look at the top 20 biggest ships still missing on the Great Lakes in 2010, one of the things you see is that a lot of them were on Lake Huron, but they were found. So vessels like the Hydrus was found in 2015, or the Clifton, found in 2016. The only ships that we really have in the top 20 that are still missing on Lake Huron are the Carruthers, which, is the biggest ship still missing on the Great Lakes. She went missing in the storm of 1913, and obviously I'm going to talk about her tonight. The other one is one of the big wooden schooner barges, the Athens, which was one of James Davidson's big wooden vessels built around the turn of the century. She was a schooner barge. She's still missing on Lake Huron as well. But one of the things I want to impress upon everybody with this list is that of the biggest vessels still missing on the Great Lakes, a large number have been found in the last 10 years. And more will be found yet. And the conventional wisdom behind it is that, NOAA has been doing this high-resolution mapping of the bottom of the Great Lakes. Their Project 2030 purports to be able to find all the ships still lost on the lakes by the mapping of the lakes. Now, they're not mapping the lakes to find the shipwrecks. NOAA doesn't really care about finding the shipwrecks. That's bycatch. They really want to map the lakes. But when they do find a site, they have to report it to the State Historic Preservation Officer. In Wisconsin, we look at those right away and usually announce them. But in other states where they don't have the staff, you won't hear about the new wrecks that they find. The state will have record of them, but they won't release them because they don't have the staff to inspect them and make sure they're archaeologically sound. In other words, they want to make sure that there's no portable artifacts. They want to document them pre-impact. So they tend not to want to release the location until they get archaeologists out there to document the site. In states where they just don't have the means to do that, they're just not going to release the locations. I will also add one caveat that they don't find all the wrecks. When they scanned here off Milwaukee and Kenosha and Racine, they missed a bunch of the smaller wrecks that were low to the bottom or that were broken. So, it's not like they're going to find everything. All right, let's talk about the top 20 ships still missing on Lake Huron. Lake Huron still has some big vessels missing, but not too many. Obviously, I'm going to talk about the biggest ships. I'm also going to talk about some of the more interesting ships that are still missing. One of the things you're going to see is that not many of these, outside of, say, the R.G. Coburn in the top three, the Carruthers, the Athens, and the Kaliyuga, not many of these are household names. Some of them, you'd be surprised that they haven't been found yet, because they're in areas where they might be found, like the schooner Fred A. Morse, just out of the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, still missing out there. Or the steamer Thousand, the Islander, the schooner Excelsior is up in the Thunder Bay area. You'd think that might have been found because they've scanned the whole area. But they've, often done it with multi-beam sonar, which is not necessarily the best tool for finding lost ships. The side scan sonar is far more effective. So anyway, these are the top 20. I had to really pan it down a little bit because I'll show you this is the total list right here of the 111 vessels that I found that are still missing on Lake Huron because they foundered offshore and have never been found. This was 130 originally, and I sent it to Dave Trotter, and I said, Dave, can you give this a look over? And he did, and he sent me back 20 ships that he had already found that were not listed on their main on Underwater Research Associates website. So that's interesting, and that were found by, and wrecks that he knew were found by other people as well. So it knocked a lot of them off. But here is the list. So you can see that it goes all the way from, pretty good sized, steel vessels right away dropping into wooden vessels. I think there's only one big steel vessel, and that's the Carruthers. And then we drop off down to, 130 footers right away by the time we get into the 20s. And when we get down here to, say, number 50, we're down to pretty small vessels. Towards the end here, we've got some early schooners, that are still missing out there in deep water. And every one of these, probably could be found if you did enough research, A lot of them are missing on Georgian Bay, because that hasn't been intensively searched. And then down here we get some of the fish tugs. We get some of the yachts, the fish tugs, little schooners, harbor tugs and work tugs that went down out in the lake. So, for example, a tug Globe, 43 feet, foundered when her propeller punctured her hull northwest of Point O'Bark. She's several miles offshore, never been found, probably because she's so small, or the 48-foot tug Vixen that foundered near Cockburn Island, never been found. And I went through pretty carefully and really researched just about every one of these. So it took me quite a bit of time. So to prepare, for example, for this talk and put this together, I had to look at every one of these 111 wrecks, 130 wrecks, and make sure that they actually were offshore and that they actually hadn't been found. Tonight I'm not going to talk about some of the more interesting ones, unfortunately. Like I wish I could talk about the steamer Asia that is still missing off Bing Inlet on Georgian Bay. Fascinating wreck. She's down there a ways. I am going to dive down out of the top 6 to talk about the R.G. Coburn tonight, because I think she's a pretty interesting wreck. There are a few others, though, that have some interesting stories. There's 2 schooners named Defiance that went down out in the lake. One was, this one was sunk by the brig William Treat off Presqu'île. There's also a Defiance that was sunk by the John J. Audubon near the same area. So there's 2 Defiances. This one's still missing. So some interesting stuff. Another one that's real interesting up on Georgian Bay is the sidewheel steamer Bruce Mines, foundered off Cape Hurd near Tobermory. A pretty famous ship. People are still looking for her. Or the brig Robert Burns, still missing up in the Straits. People have been looking for this wreck for years. So anyway, I won't dwell on it for too long. But these are some of the heavy hitters that people are still looking for. All right. Let's talk about how they get found. So finding the lost ships on Lake Huron is, not as hard perhaps, because a lot of the ships that were lost on Lake Huron were on the shipping lanes. They were in transit, the big ships. And and this is where Dave Trotter comes in. I've known Dave for many years, and I knew that, give a talk about the ships that are still missing on Lake Huron, a lot of the talk would be about Dave. Dave has found in the area of 100 of the ships that were missing on Lake Huron. So if you look at that figure on Lake Michigan, which is like we have about 220 still missing, if it wasn't for Dave Trotter, there'd be about 220 still missing on Lake Huron. Instead, there's 110. He has found the vast majority of them with his team from Underwater Research Associates. The way he does it, his methodology is not to go out looking for individual ships. He goes out and scans the shipping lanes and just mows the lawn and runs over stuff. And they go down and dive them and see what they are. And he's been doing that since the mid-1970s with great success. A lot of the ships that he's found, they still don't know what they are even. So he has a lot of unidentified hulls that they've run over. And they don't release everything necessarily that they find unless they get a chance to identify it or dive it. So it's possible that even more of the 111 ships on my list have actually been found by Dave, because they really, he showed me one time how much of Lake Huron he's actually covered. It's amazing. It's just amazing how much bottom they've covered. They go out in the spring in a big boat, and they go out overnight. They go out for days on end, and just, if the weather's good, they just run. And he's still doing it well into his 80s. So my hats off to Dave for all the work he's done, and for the amazing number of ships that he's found on Lake Huron. All right, so the remaining ships are going to be hard to find. And just to go into the usual, why do we look for them? Well, they're well preserved. They're time capsules. They're often, a ship on the ocean, they're usually torn apart by marine boring worms and things, whereas on the Great Lakes, they can be pristine, like a ship in a bottle, with all the artifacts still in them from the 1850s, 1860s. And each one has a unique story, about who owned it, where it was coming from, and who built it, and who was on board, and what they were doing. Nowadays, we treat these all as archaeological sites, mostly because we recognize how important they are and how unique they are in the world here on the Great Lakes, that this cold, fresh water has preserved them. And also laws were passed because a lot of the artifacts were disappearing into people's basements and were not being conserved and were eventually thrown out. So not all of them, of course, were thrown out, but a lot of them met that fate. So it was decided, in 1987, the federal government passed the Abandoned Shipwreck Act, which wasn't really aimed at the Great Lakes. It was actually aimed at Spanish galleons, but it had the effect of awarding all these ships to the states in whose waters they lie. So the states now consider these all archaeological sites, and with very few exceptions, they're all claimed by the states. There are a few wrecks that are privately owned in Lake Huron. The Bentley, I think, is owned by Paul Ehorn as a result of a court case. The other reason we want to look for these is they have a shelf life. These ships are not going to be like they are in 50 years. We've seen that they collapse. Zebra and quagga mussels have done their worst. And even in deeper water, ice and waves can have an impact. So we want to find them and document them before they, collapse, or before, we can no longer learn from them. So to find these wrecks, in my case, I do original research. Dave does somewhat too after he finds it, to identify them, but and he does have a good idea of what might be out there as well. But it helps to do original research. In the case of what we use, though, it's side scan sonar, usually a low frequency, high range sonar. I think Dave Trotter runs the only 50 kilohertz Klein on the Great Lakes. That's really low frequency. It can see a long, long distance. But, it might miss a fish tug that's on the bottom, but it won't miss the Carruthers. Also, a lot of these ships are deep, and you can't dive them, so you need an ROV or a drop camera. And, mostly what you need, though, is a big boat. And the problem is that big boats get gallons to the mile, not miles to the gallon. Most of the ships are more than 10 miles out, so, you need a seaworthy boat. And probably the biggest challenge is getting a weather window, because side-scan sonar doesn't work real well in waves over about 2 feet. You get into 3 feet and you're not seeing real well anymore. how often do we get calm weather 10 miles from shore on the Great Lakes? Well, not real often. It usually happens in May and June. By the time you get into July and August, it starts to kick up out there, and it's fairly rough. So there's a short weather window, and oftentimes we'll get all set to go, and we'll get blown off the lake, or we'll just sit there in the marina after getting all the gear together. So who's still looking on Lake Huron? Well, Dave Trotter's certainly still looking. He finds wrecks every year. A couple of guys that I know quite well, Mark Gamage and Joe Van Wagenen, also look in Lake Huron a little bit. I know Dan Fountain has searched in Lake Huron and found a few things. And then the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary and NOAA have also scanned the sanctuary there looking for wrecks. And I wouldn't doubt that they have found some that they're sitting on. So that certainly is another group. So that's who's looking. And that's why we're looking for them. So without further ado, I'm going to take you through the most sought wrecks that are left on Lake Huron, one by one. And as I mentioned, most of the ships have, been found. But the biggest ship that's still missing on the Great Lakes is on Lake Huron, and people are actively looking for it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened to each one of these. I'm going to tell you their story, and then I'm also going to go and grid it for you and show you where I think the wreck could be based on my research. And I with each one of these, I took a deep dive, and some of these are quite interesting. So I'm going to ask a favor. If you're still hearing me and I'm still broadcasting, make a quick post in the chat so I know that I'm still broadcasting, because I haven't seen anything there for a little while. All right, let's dive in. The first wreck that I'm going to talk about is not one of the 5 or 6 largest on the Great Lakes. It's actually the 9th largest ship. I'm sorry, on Lake Huron. It's actually the 9th largest ship. Still missing, and it's the steamer R.G. Coburn. Coburn's a fairly famous wreck. In some circles, she's considered a treasure ship. So the R.G. Coburn was lost very early in her career. This is a ship that was built in 1870 at Marine City, Michigan. Pretty good sized vessel, almost 200 feet long, a wooden-hulled steamer. She foundered on October 15th, 1871. So you can see she was built in 1870. She didn't last too long. She was carrying 75 passengers and crew and a cargo of flour and wheat, as well as 30 barrels of silver ore from the Silver Islet mine up on Lake Superior. And so, pretty significant cargo. These are the only known pictures of her. This is one photo of her. She sailed for Ward's Lake Superior line. This is at Duluth. I also just acquired and found a new photo of her that was previously unknown. This is also at Duluth from a stereo view in my collection. This is also her, the R.G. Coburn, in her final colors. This is probably the last photo ever taken of her. This may have actually been made just before she left to go on her fateful voyage down the lakes. All right, some key points. She was heading down the lakes right during the Great Forest Fires of 1871 that burned, Peshtigo and parts of Door County, Wisconsin, and also burned Chicago. And there was a lot of smoke. She was off Presqu'île, and the visibility was pretty bad, and the waves started to come up. She was in the company of some other vessels, and those vessels tucked into Presqu'île. But her captain decided to keep going while other vessels ran for shelter. And they got down past Thunder Bay at about 4 a.m. Big weather started to come up. Huge waves. One of the worst storms of the season, or of the 5-year period. And her cargo of grain shifted, causing the vessel to sort of take a tilt, and she lost her rudder. If you know anything about losing a rudder in heavy seas, you know that that's the kiss of death, right? This vessel was really in trouble, in big trouble, because she really, couldn't make headway. Right, when a vessel loses its rudder like this, they're dead in the water and stuck in the trough of the waves. So she started to pitch violently, and her cargo of barreled silver ore started to roll around, and it knocked holes in her sides near her cargo doors that you see here. So it became clear that she was going to go down. The captain gave the order to launch the lifeboats. They had 4 lifeboats, but only 2 of them stayed afloat because the waves were so heavy. And at least 32 lives were lost. About a little over half of the people survived. And it's the survivor accounts that tell us the most about what happened to this vessel. So we know the last authoritative account that we know of her location is she was off Presqu'île at 10 p.m. The wind turned out of the southwest, so it was coming right off of Saginaw Bay here, and started to blow a 15-mile-per-hour gale with 15-foot waves. And they increased between about 10 a.m. Saturday and 10 a.m. Sunday to a real gale. The survivors say that they'd made it past Thunder Bay when her rudder became unshipped. But she was still under power. She was broadside to the waves that were coming out of the southwest, and she still had her propeller going. So she likely, even though she didn't have steerage, her engines were still going. So she may have still been traveling along this course because she was broadside to these waves. Now, they say that at 7 a.m. she foundered, and the folks left. The lifeboats were launched. So we think that she's at least somewhere. She made it this far past Thunder Bay, and we know that she was afloat for about 3 more hours. One of the other things we know is the lifeboats came ashore down here. The wind had swung out of the south and come around to be out of the northwest, and so it would have blown the lifeboats here to this shore where they were found. Now, the first lifeboats, I should add too, were picked up in the shipping lane by other vessels. So other vessels, the shipping lanes, as you can see, all are run here on the left side of the lake, right? And because the lifeboats were picked up in the shipping lane here, we know that, for example, it hadn't blown way up here, it hadn't blown like 10, 20 miles up, because the lifeboats were right in this first box when they were picked up. Okay, so this is about the grid. I think she could be further over this way, maybe a little further north, but this has been searched. Most of this grid has been searched by Dave Trotter. Certainly the southern half has. She could be further out in the lake a little bit. She could be a little further north. When they say she made it past Thunder Bay, maybe it was here and maybe she only got this far. Who knows? But I think this is a decent grid for the RG Coburn. And because the lifeboats came ashore here after the wind swung around, I think she's probably somewhere in here. This is hard to search. It's a long way from shore. It's far from anything, and I think I'd concentrate on the northern half at this point because just knowing what I know about where Dave has painted, I think he's done the southern half. So that's the RG Coburn. The silver ore, very high grade stuff out of the Silver Islet mine up in Canada on northern Lake Superior. It's worth a lot of money. I don't think you could recover it. I don't think the state of Michigan would be like, oh yeah, sure, go ahead. So I think she's a treasure ship in name only. All right, let's move along to some of the other wrecks. Okay, I'm not able to see, just for the record, if people are actually still able to see the video. It's not, the real-time stats aren't working real well, so if you can't see it, if this is locked up, I am recording it, so I know that I will post it in a little bit. All right, let's continue onward to our next wreck. I'm going to talk next about a ship that's wasn't really lost in an accident, but I'm going to talk about it for a couple of reasons. This is the big bulk freighter Norman P. Clement. It's a big vessel. She's over 250 feet long. She was a steel bulk carrier built in 1923 at the Isle of Wight in Great Britain. because she was Canadian, right? And so a lot of these vessels were built in in Britain for Canada for the grain trade with Fort William. And this vessel was on the lakes for a long time. In 1961, she was converted to a sulfuric acid tanker. And that'll become significant here in a little bit. In October 1968, she grounded at Britain, Ontario, which is up by Georgian Bay. She was pulled off and freed and taken to Collingwood, which is down on southern Georgian Bay, for repairs. And on October 16th, 1968, she had a massive explosion because of the sulfuric acid cargo. Sulfuric acid that they were carrying was very concentrated and very volatile, and it literally exploded, injuring 11 people. Now, what do you do when you've got a freighter and it's 1968 and it's exploded and splattered sulfuric acid all over the place and hurt a bunch of people, and the boat's a mess and it's going to require a bunch of environmental cleanup? Well, you take it out and you do a midnight scuttle. And I am not exactly sure that this was legal. The owners in the shipyard contracted the tug Dana Thomas Bowen, and they towed this vessel out to a point that they said was off Christian Island and scuttled it in a reported 350 feet of water. There was a Coast Guard helicopter nearby, and they took pictures of it as it went down. So many of you have probably seen these famous pictures of a Great Lakes freighter going down. It's the Norman P. Clement, and they actually took the photos as she foundered. This is her in service in life, but here you can even see some of the damage in the front here where she exploded and blew her hatch off. That's the tug Dana Thomas Bowen towing her as she went down. So why do I include the Norman P. Clement if she wasn't lost to an accident? Well, it's because they intentionally obfuscated the location in the press by giving multiple different locations. And the wreck really wasn't supposed to be found. They don't want this found. And because they don't want it found, well, that's a good excuse to go out and find it. All right, so let's talk about where the Norman P. Clement is. Oopsies, that's the wrong one. We went into the Carruthers somehow. The Norman P. Clement, there are a few different conflicting locations. So the Canadian list of merchant vessels gives this figure 443730 by 801000. That plot's way the hell over here, directly off Collingwood in shallow water. I don't think that's where she ended up. They also say she was 18 miles and 25 miles from Collingwood towards Christian Island. That puts her here and here, respectively. But they also said she was in 350 feet of water. And there's only one place that gets 350 feet deep in this area, and it's not that far off Christian Island. It's right up here in this little basin, up here in the Thornbury Basin. If I was to look for this ship, I think I would look in that hole right there. Because they knew, they had a bathymetric chart. You know, they had maps of the lake in 1968. They knew where it was 350 feet deep. I think they wanted to put this ship in deep water. And I also don't think they wanted people to know where she was sunk. So, and they had sonar available. They would have been able to tell that it was 350 feet deep or so there when they scuttled her. So I think she's here. This is an interesting wreck. I think somebody should go and put I don't know if I want to dive in. I doubt the sulfuric acid is still a hazard on her, but you might want to put your ROV down there, you know. Not a real expensive ROV either. Maybe it'd get eaten by the acid. I don't know. Norman P. Clement, still not found. All right, let's move on. The Kaliyuga. This is a pretty famous one that people talk about, looking for. Every few years, somebody claims it's been found. What happens is there's been a few big wooden scuttles found in the southern part of Lake Huron. We're talking about these big wooden vessels that were laid up, you know, down at Port Huron and down in the river down there, in the St. Clair River. And eventually they would sink or outlive their usefulness, and they'd tow them out off Port Huron into Lake Huron, and they'd scuttle them. And there's a bunch of these big wooden hulls, and they get found every so often, and people say, oh, it's the Kaliyuga. The problem is none of them really matched in size, and also that ain't where the Kaliyuga is. So let's talk about her. This vessel was lost in 1905 in one of the big gales of the fall of 1905 in October. She was built in 1887. She was a 270-foot wooden freighter, and so by 1905 she was not considered a really big vessel. By 1905, they were building 590-foot steel steamers on the Great Lakes, like the William C. Moreland, I think was built that year, and she was over 500 feet. So she was a little long in the tooth, but she was built for the iron ore trade on the Great Lakes and up to Lake Superior, and she was lost with a cargo of iron ore. She was heading from Marquette, Michigan, to Cleveland, Ohio, and she encountered a really bad storm. The October of 1905 storm is often overshadowed by the great storm of November 1905, the Mataafa storm. But people often overlook the fact that the month earlier there was another really violent storm. So the Kaliyuga passed down through the Sioux Locks at 5 a.m. on Thursday, October 19th. I actually found that in the news micros myself. She got down off, she made her exit through Detour, and she was on her way down the coast when she was hit with a southwest gale that had 60-mile-an-hour winds. Her last verified location was between Sheboygan and Thunder Bay. She vanished with 17 crew, although bodies did wash ashore. Let's talk about where she is. She was last seen off of Presqu'île at 4 p.m. on October 19th by the steamer Frontenac, and she was about 7 miles off Presqu'île, and she was headed east. That makes some sense, I guess, heading out towards the shipping lane, and then she was going to turn south. The wind swung out of the northwest at about 3 a.m. on the 20th, so it was quite a ways later that the wind swung out of the northeast. She was last seen, like I say, right up here off port of Presqu'île. Nothing much was seen of her until wreckage was found by the steamer Lily Smith, 40 miles south of Cove Island. So down here. So you go 40 miles south of Cove Island, this is where the wreckage was reported. And then wreckage and bodies came ashore at Kincardine and Southampton. So down here and down here, wreckage and bodies came ashore. And remember, the wind swung out, first was out of the southwest, then swung out of the northwest. So conventional wisdom is that she got blown out here. Most people think she broke her rudder, kind of like what happened to the Coburn. It's a common thing on Lake Huron because you get these bad gales that come out of that they hit these vessels on the stern. They part their rudder chains and then they fall into the trough. There's a very big search grid for this vessel because we know she was last seen up here. Here's where the wreckage was found. Here's where things came ashore. Probably in this search grid up here, she could be almost anywhere because, again, nobody saw her. The grid's far from land. Her last known position and first wreckage report are probably the best vectors. She could have been blown further to the east, and then in that storm came around to the northwest and carried her debris down here. It's a tough one. This is the toughest wreck to find. Most people say the boat's fate will never be known. Oddly enough, the mate, thought dead, turned up alive. He missed the ship. They left him behind. He was the only survivor. So I think this is the hardest wreck to find. It's up in an area of the lake that's tough. I will say that there's a ridge. The Mid-Lake Ridge runs through here, and it's possible she's up there in shallower water on the ridge. This is one that could be found by that NOAA mapping project. It's a good-sized ship, and they're interested in this area, these ridges up here. So maybe she'll be found by NOAA. All right, let's move on. Kaliyuga. All right, the second biggest ship still missing on Lake Huron is the schooner barge Athens. This is one of what we call Davidson's Goliaths, the big wooden ships that were built at West Bay City when everyone else had switched to building ships out of steel. There were a few reasons why they were building out of wood. It was cheaper. Davidson's yards were designed to build with wood, and they still had sources for wood. Even though to build a ship like the Athens took about 50 yards of white oak forest, or 50 acres, I'm sorry, of white oak forest to be cut down. So you had to cut down a pretty good sized forest to build one of these things. 294 feet long, 45 feet wide. This is a huge vessel. She was lost after 30 years on the lakes, so built 1897, lost 1917. She had been built for the bulk freight trades. We call these schooners loosely. She was originally built with 3 masts, and she even had top masts, as you see here, so she could set sails and top sails. But she almost never did. These vessels were built for the tow line by the 1880s, when they were building big schooner barges like this. They really were meant to be towed behind a steamer, because they just couldn't go as fast as a steamship. And if they were becalmed, or if they had to go up the St. Mary's River or up the St. Clair River, they had to be towed. So they just towed them behind a steamer. The other reason that they like to build these is they didn't take space for engines and stuff. They had a lot more cargo capacity than, say, a steamship that had to have a lot of machinery fore and aft. So they were very cost effective. This vessel, it was a little long in the tooth. They weren't carrying iron ore a lot with her because she was getting soft. So she was bound from Harbor Beach, Michigan to Little Current, Ontario, up by Georgian Bay, carrying 3,500 tons of soft bituminous coal. She was being towed by the Canadian tug Lucknow, and they encountered a huge storm with hail, really, really large hail. And the tow line broke. So the Lucknow started, circling her, but there was little they could do. Allegedly, it was golf ball size hail. As they were circling her, trying to pick her tow line back up, she broke in half and went down about 25 miles west, they say, of Southampton, Ontario. 5 of her 8 crew were lost, including the captain, his son, and their woman cook. So this is a findable wreck, I think. This particular ship, the captain knew his location with reasonable accuracy. He reported that he was off of Point Clark when they started to run into trouble. The weather came up. And so he decided to run for Southampton. Southampton is right here, where you see this red dot. And he said he was 25 miles west of Southampton. So I think he would have been coming up the middle of the lake, and he started to run for Southampton when he was off Point Clark. But 25 miles off, I think this is about the grid he would have been on, because this is the lane he would have been on. They were heading up here, for the passage. I think this ship is probably out here in fairly deep water, and again, not a very big grid. Nobody's looked for the Athens because there's not a lot of people looking for shipwrecks here off of this area. It is quite a ways out from shore, but of the ships on this list, I'd say she's the second most findable after the Clement, I think. All right, let's talk about the biggest ship still missing, and obviously the biggest mystery, and a lot of people are looking for her. This is the James Carruthers. She is by far the biggest ship still missing on the Great Lakes. She was built in 1913 at Collingwood, Ontario. She was about 530 feet long, almost 60 feet wide. If this ship had not gone down, she could have lasted into the 1970s, because these big steel freighters of this era lasted a long time. A lot of times they just kept getting repurposed and repowered and converted to self-unloaders. So she was brand new when she was lost. The captain said that the paint in the crew's quarters were still tacky when she went on this voyage. She was the largest Canadian steamer on the lakes at the time she was lost. She was built at Collingwood. The 1913 storm is generally considered to be a 500-year weather event on the Great Lakes. This had sustained winds of 70 miles an hour and gusts up to 90 miles an hour. There were sustained waves of 35 feet. occasional rogues to 40 or 50. The only storm that even comes close is the Armistice Day storm of 1940, but that was relatively isolated to Lake Michigan. This ship was bound from Fort William to Midland, Ontario. She was carrying 375,000 bushels of wheat. Incidentally, a cargo notorious for shifting. At 1 a.m. on November 9th, she stopped to refuel at Detour, Michigan, up northern Lake Huron, with the J.H. Sheetal following her. The Sheetal last saw the Carruthers just after dawn, when the Carruthers turned to the east for Georgian Bay. And that's where she was bound. She was bound for Georgian Bay with this cargo, because that's Midland, Ontario, on Georgian Bay. The Sheetal was the last vessel ever to see her. And the storm raged for a full day until November 10th. This was the largest ship lost, incidentally, in the 1913 storm. 12 major ships were lost in that storm. There are very few still missing. I think the Plymouth on Lake Michigan is the only one still missing other than the Carruthers. It's because a lot of the other ships there were a lot of wreckage that came ashore, and they were searched for and found, in many cases, by Dave Trotter, because they were in that area that he searched along the shipping lanes, or it was sort of known where they were because of where the debris came ashore. With the Carruthers, we do have some information about where she probably is, and I think she's right by the Athens. I would bet that the Carruthers went down within 10 miles of the Athens. Now, I'm going to tell you why. She's generally believed to have lost steerage somewhere in the northern end of the lake. So she came out here. She was last seen here by the Sheetal, heading this way. However, we have debris coming ashore way the hell down here. Now, the Armistice Day storm was blowing out of the northeast. She was coming, blowing out of up here. But, how far did the ship make it? Did it make it here, and then did its debris blow down here? Or did the ship get blown down here? I think the ship got blown down here, and I'm going to tell you why. I was researching the Armistice Day storm, and ships, a lot of the William B. Davik, for example, was in a following sea, with the storm at her back, and those huge waves hitting her stern. To hear the crew of some of the vessels that survived the storm describe what the waves were doing to the vessel's rudder. In the case of the Davik, it broke the rudder chains. I think that's what happened to the Davik. I think she made it part of the way here, but I think she fell into the trough of the seas and was driven with the storm, and probably stayed afloat for quite some time. Now, one of the things that was reported that I think is key here is that off Southampton, they reported seeing distress rockets off on the horizon during the height of the storm. And this was really kind of the only vessel that would have been out in that area. And I think that is pretty good proof, because then the debris comes ashore, all down here, and it didn't look like it had been beaten and battered. Like, it looked like they had only been maybe on the surface for a few hours, not, for 10 hours or something like that. Also, I think, this area here, right off Inver Huron, is where I think she lies. So, one other thing that I should mention, my old friend Harry Zeich, the old wreck hunter, passed away a few years ago. Harry, I never forget, he had a job that he did here out of Southampton, and he came back and said he thought he found the Carruthers. Now, Harry was famous for running over stuff and proclaiming that he had found a ship without even ever dropping anything down on it, without ever having any evidence. He'd just run over something and say, I found this and that. And then he'd claim, he was pretty dogged about it. This is his side scan image of what he found, what he imaged in the deep water offshore there. This is a vessel that looks like it's laying on its side. It's casting a pretty good shadow, and it's on the edge of some sort of a geological feature here. Harry was pretty confident that he had found the Carruthers, but he never went back, and he never gave me the numbers, and he took them to the grave with him. That was back in 2002 that he told me about that. So if it turns out that it looks like that on the bottom, I guess Harry found it. But I do think it's out here in this grid. I don't think it made it very far. I think she broke her rudder. I think she was driven in the trough down here, and I think she foundered somewhere out here where she was firing the rockets, and then that's it. The debris washed up on the beach here. So those are the big wrecks still missing on Lake Huron. The Carruthers, I think, will be found. I have very little doubt that the Carruthers will be found someday. She's just too big to miss on the bottom, and the grid isn't all that big, I think. So if people go out and search that grid, I mean, that's not a small grid, mind you. That's going to take you some time, but it's certainly findable. So with that, I want to thank everybody who joined me tonight. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'm not getting any of the posts and feedback back from the presentation, so I'm not really sure that this worked. I'm going to end the live stream here, and then I'm going to go ahead and pull this down and put it up on YouTube and repost it, so you can all watch it on YouTube if you didn't get to see this. So again, thanks everybody who joined, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions for me, I'll try to get to them. I'm going to probably get to see the chat here at the end once I sign off, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. So thanks again, everybody, and stay tuned. It's going to be 2 months from now. I'm going to do Lost Leviathans, Lake Erie. It's a lake that I've studied quite a bit, and I think it'll be very interesting. So have a nice evening, everybody. Good night.